Are you ready to enlarge your territory? Empire Transport is ready, willing, and able to cover all your transportation needs, both long haul and local. We service South Carolina, throughout the southeastern United States, and across the country. Sound good? In addition to freight hauling, Empire Transport also offers a 24/7 taxi service in South Carolina and the greater Charlotte area, and a mobile mechanic service where we come to you. Empire Transport, your go-to for freight hauls, taxi service, and mobile mechanic work. Learn more at empiretransport.co. Come and enlarge your territory with us. Welcome to Kingdom Now, the podcast featuring faith with an edge, as we celebrate the kingdom of God within you. I'm your host, Dr. Leanne Marino, apostle, author, and theologian, and founder of Spitfire Apostolic Ministries and all the works that go along with it. I'm excited to share this program with you as we explore the ins and outs of counterculture Christianity present as you live out the kingdom of God in your everyday life. Want to learn more? Visit my website at kingdompowernow.org. And now, our program, which features a variety of formats here just for you. Interviews, teaching and preaching proclaimed everywhere from my North Carolina studio to Sanctuary and beyond, and powerful insights here for now as we turn the world upside down everywhere we go. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, happy whatever time of day it is, wherever you are. And to our listeners in Romania, we say, Bună ziua! We hope that whatever time of day when you were listening, that you are having a good one. And I welcome you to this edition of the Kingdom Now podcast. And I am your host, Apostle Dr. Leanne Marino, here as the Spitfire, serving as the voice of counterculture Christianity, where we feature the theme of faith with an edge. And if you'd like to learn more about the world of counterculture Christianity, feel free to visit my website at kingdompowernow.org. This special edition of the Kingdom Now podcast was a Metanoia Sunday School program presented in December of 2023 at Sanctuary International Fellowship Tabernacle, SIFT, in Charlotte, North Carolina. If you would like to learn more about the work of Sanctuary, feel free to visit our website at welcomeinthisplace.org. Okay, yeah, actually, you can see everything, all right. Okay, so it is not our normal week, but we had circumstances last week, so we're here this week, and so we're here with our Sunday school program, which is called Metanoia, and we have Spiritual Warfare 101 by popular request.
Yay!
I think you requested it.
Kind of.
Okay, yeah, you kind of requested it.
Yeah.
Okay, so you kind of requested it, and then that's what we're gonna go with. So when we talk about spiritual warfare, which, by the way, there's a relief, I think it's bronze, there's like a little bronze thing that you can buy, like, and put on a desk that's that. I want one. When we talk about spiritual warfare, so what do you all think of? And I mean, and if it's very extreme, crazy people creating militias, that's absolutely fine, because I'll probably mention them.
It's, people are like, demons are at work and everything. There's demons in Harry Potter, demons in D&D. Intense prayer and fasting.
Well, those were two very different answers, okay? Although the people who are into all that are often into that as well, so, okay.
She says the same coin.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, I knew when I lived in the Raleigh area, and this is going back some years, I mean, this woman was not young then, so she may not even be alive now. I don't know whatever happened to her, but she used to do, like, 90-day fasts. I mean, she would, yeah. And she wouldn't answer her phone, and she wouldn't go out, and yeah.
Would she just abstain from eating the entire time?
That much I don't know. I think
It's
that
like
she
how?
like would not eat a lot. Like, she might eat once a day or something like that.
So I was
but-
like, the human body is not meant. Human body can't survive 3 weeks without food.
Well, but she would go pretty close. So she was eating pretty much next to nothing. I mean, and so at that time, and what I will say is spiritual warfare was a really, really big thing at one point in time around this time. In fact, there's a spiritual warfare Bible that I do not recommend anybody goes and buys. one of the major authors for it, there were like 3 or 4 major authors for it who are still on all this stuff all these years later. Like, they haven't evolved to any other topic. One of them, I don't remember her full name, and I'm not going to mention it anyway, but she ran for office in Florida where she lived at one point in time, and she came to Durham. I heard her speak in Durham, and the whole basic summary of the spiritual warfare thing was that everybody needed to be sure to give to rout demons. So we're going to kind of leave it there.
I was looking up the spiritual warfare Bible.
Oh, I can show it to you. I've got one upstairs.
Ooh.
I will recommend it for reference purposes,
Okay.
but I do not recommend it I'm saying that because we are live. I do not actually recommend it for actual spiritual purposes. It was New King James, which is not my favorite translation anyway, and the commentary basically narrated the entire Bible through the lens of spiritual warfare. So passages that might have had absolutely nothing to do with it suddenly became about demon chasing. And I don't even know if it's sold anymore. That's
Okay,
yeah, I don't even know if you can buy it now.
Or some on Amazon, but
Well, I'm sure that you can buy used copies, but like I don't know if you can go walk into a bookstore like Barnes and Noble and make an order it.
Okay, yeah.
So that it would be in kind of that context. But it was really, really, really in, and people were really, really, really obnoxious. And I'm saying that as somebody who was part of all that at one point in time, I might not have been quite as extreme as everybody else was, but I kind of did the everything's a demon and there's a demon behind every corner, and that, we have to be aware of the enemy that we have. And I believe that we have to be aware of the enemy that we have, but I also don't think that everything that happens is the enemy that we have. People have other influences. Now we talk a lot about mental health, and that was not a conversation that we really had at that point in time. They pretty much assumed mental illness was demonic. And there are still people who feel that, but, we kind of didn't have enough of a conversation about mental health. And we didn't talk about balance and wellness and self-care and things like that. I did a recording with a pastor in St. Louis who actually I've heard speak before in person. We were both in a conference together about 6 years ago in Atlanta, and he made the point of saying that he's always really fascinated by the passages where Jesus reached out to the people, and then it basically says that Jesus went off by himself. And we kind of super spiritualize that because we go, oh, he was praying or this or that. He was saying, no, y'all, I need some me time. I need some space from y'all.
Yeah.
And that really, there's nothing wrong with that. And so in keeping with that kind of thing, we weren't real balanced. We didn't really approach.
Are we ever balanced?
No, probably not. We didn't approach things with a whole lot of moderation, which is going to be relevant in this later on. But I think that it was very much kind of a thing where we were really into it and we were really extreme, and it was easy to think that everything bad that happened or everything that we didn't like was warfare. And you might spend hours. I knew one in particular, she didn't pay her bills, and she sat there believing God was going to keep her from getting evicted or was going to keep her from getting a car repossessed. And when the car was repossessed, it was the devil. And I was like, no, your agreement wasn't with the devil, it was with the car people, and you didn't pay for it. So, we kind of had these narrations, and what I'm going to say about the narration that I think is very important, and you guys are going to definitely resonate with it, is that it was like we were the center of the universe, and everything was trying to conspire against us, and everything was trying to stop the work that we were trying to do, instead of just taking a deep breath and going, dude, stuff happens. Things happen sometimes, and kind of getting some perspective. We were very much out of control. But when I step back and I think about it, it was like there was nobody but us. We were like it, and the whole forces of hell were coming against us all the time. It's like, get a grip, kind of thing. Now in hindsight, it sounds obviously very different. So our first topic is, what is spiritual warfare? So it's the basic principle that there are spiritual forces for good and evil, and both have the power to influence the believer. So basically, God works through people, Satan works through people. They basically kind of work in the same way for opposite purposes. And I mean, maybe that's really kind of simplistic, but kind of the beginning and the ending of it is that. So the precept that there's an enemy, he's interested in fighting to get us away from God, and the enemy manifests in different ways in our lives. That's actually found in my book on demonology, which everybody can go get on Amazon, that I'm actually kind of doing a sequel for. So we'll talk more about that when that comes out. Okay, so what does that teach us about spiritual warfare? Now, one of the reasons why I think spiritual warfare is actually a very, very big topic to teach on, and I think it's actually kind of a difficult topic to teach on, is because it often revolves around the specific issues and temptations and thought processes of each individual person. And unless you're in everybody's mind and you know everybody's temptations, which I throw in there, but I don't think they're the only thing, because basically spiritual warfare is traditionally taught to be anti-temptation. So in other words, you've got things that you're quote unquote kind of tempted to run into or tempted to do that you shouldn't do. And we know what the standard temptations are: drinking, smoking, sex, being attracted to the same sex, thinking you're a different gender. We all know what those quote unquote temptations are often listed as being. We're not going to get into what?
Those last two are pretty fun, so
Well, we're not going to get into whether or not those are legitimate things or not. That's not the purpose of this, but basically that when you feel tempted to quote unquote do anything, that it's the devil and you've got to fight that temptation. But I think that spiritual warfare is a bigger issue. I think it's a bigger thing. Like we say, it's kind of like we're caught up in a much bigger cosmic battle. And that means that as being a part of that sometimes, once again, things happen. And sometimes they happen just because they happen. Sometimes they happen from a spiritual perspective, and it's learning to kind of identify both. So what does this teach us? Well, the first thing it teaches us is that we wrestle not against flesh and blood. Now that is in Scripture. So from a spiritual perspective, everything that happens isn't always about what we might see or what might be obvious. And sometimes I go on the premise, and I've talked about this actually with Julie quite a bit, that we might be caught up in something and we don't ever even know what it is, that there is constantly a conflict in the spiritual realm. So sometimes we might have a spiritual response to something and we might never even know what it is, because it may not actually really have to do with anything that we're doing, right or wrong, or anything of that nature. So when there's constant conflict between the divine and the demonic, sometimes we experience it, as I just said. And the enemies we face use people but aren't people. So this is not to take the human element out of things. See, we kind of like to do that with spiritual stuff. And we tend to kind of like to do that. We don't fight against flesh and blood, so I'm going to make an idiot of myself and call out demons all day. People are still accountable for what they do. We're still accountable if we do something that's not right. We're still accountable if somebody does something or we do something and it has a negative effect on somebody else. We are accountable for our behavior, but it recognizes that the enemies that we face kind of pull the strings behind people and maybe lead them into things that they shouldn't. So this is how I explain it. Mental health talks about the mind, and physical health talks about the body, and the spiritual realm kind of talks about things from a spiritual perspective. So to me, it does not nullify mental health. Good God, go to a counselor already. I mean, go get some help. If you need help, if you need medication. In fact, I remember years ago, I knew somebody who was in Europe and was really, really, really evangelical. Like really, really from that time frame, and we're talking like 2004, 2005, in that era where everything was go team and spiritual warfare and all this and that. And he knew quite a few people, they stopped taking their medication for bipolar or for depression or for this or for that, because they felt that if they were not taking it, that if they took it, it was somehow against the spiritual battle. And I said, well, did you ever think that maybe by taking it, you are fighting the spiritual battle?
You want to be crying on the bathroom floor for that reason.
Exactly. Well, and that maybe you are fighting the enemy by taking your medication, because if you just, stop taking it, then you're going to be more susceptible to different things. Now, for me to have said that many years ago, that was kind of revolutionary because we weren't there yet. And to be saying that, I think it's a very, very important thing to say, because I think we often give foothold to the enemy with our extremes, and that we're going to talk about in a little bit. So spiritual warfare is not about doing something wrong. And I'm thinking of that guy in the Bible who was blind for so long, and everybody came and said, or he was crippled, or there was something wrong with it. Whose sin was it, you or your parents, or was it someone else? And Jesus said it didn't have nothing to do with any of it.
Right.
And so we often assume that it's about doing something. People talk about giving the devil foothold and opening up the door and this and that and something else. And I mean, I'm not saying that that's impossible, but it's not always the case. So most of the people who dealt with spiritual warfare were usually doing the right things. So like, for example, Job was caught up in a total battle between Satan and God that wasn't about him. It just kind of involved him. And I'm thinking about the blog that you did, where you talked about Job. So that it involved him. It really wasn't about him, though, but he got involved in it. And Paul experienced so much spiritual warfare, he wrote about putting on armor. And we had Jesus was tempted in the wilderness. Now, we know Jesus didn't do anything wrong. So sometimes you're doing everything right. And actually, most of the time you are. And that's when it's there. So Satan likes getting people off assignment. And it starts typically with very, very small things. And so we just gave those different examples. And spiritual warfare, as I said earlier, is very, very unique to us because there are commonalities in it. This is not to say that we can't have things in common with other people. But it is to say that the way that we discern or perceive them is often very, very unique to our own experience with God and the gifts that we have and the calling that we have. And learning how we are spiritually targeted takes a lot of discernment and insight, and we gain that through experience, we gain it through study, we gain it as we kind of go through this thing in our lives and we learn more about it. So I mean, for me to come on and tell you, you're being spiritually attacked today, okay? I might know that if God told me that, or you don't feel good because you're being spiritually attacked. I can't really answer that because it's something that we come to know, I mean, unless God gives us a revelation about it. And an awful lot of the time when people have revelation about it, it's not God. So what's the purpose of it? So I think that a very, very fair question that theologians do not take seriously enough is, if we believe that Satan has already been defeated, and so we know that from studying the resurrection that Jesus defeated sin and death, okay, then why do we still have to deal with Satan? Shouldn't he be retired in the dry heat of hell by now? Okay, and I think that that's a very, very fair, I think it's a fair question. So there isn't just one answer to the question, but what I would say most theologians do not agree about it. And the best answer I can give is that Jesus didn't just come into the world to overcome sin, death, and Satan conceptually. So this goes to what we talk about, like the difference between the East and the West theologically in terms of the resurrection. And so it's like we would talk about, it might be defeated in more of a cosmic sense, but it's also so that we could be overcome in our lives on a personal level. So in other words, this is more of a progressive overcoming rather than something that's just instantaneous. So the short answer or the existential answer would be that God still doesn't override our will. And the resurrection still does not override the personal decision to sin or not to sin. Yes?
So is it kind of basically like, hey, this thing is done, but you have to enter into it for it to be done for you to?
Yes.
Okay.
And that would be like the way to describe it. And so in other words, it's still not a decision that's made for us. It's still a battle that we can experience as people. And that would be the difference between saying it's defeated conceptually and that it's defeated for us, because not everybody abides by that type of a principle. So that would be how that works. So in other words, Jesus just doesn't come into our lives and we suddenly stop sinning. Sin is something that affects the entire human race on a personal level. It's not something we just overcome with our thinking or our good intentions or because we feel like it one day. And we can't do it without Jesus, because Jesus is not going to force us to do the right thing in situations. Not to mention it's not always clear what the right thing is or what that means in every single situation, because it's part of what we would call, and this depends on who you're listening to as far as teaching goes, they talk about the learning curve of sin. In other words, that it's almost like sin is a very, very long-lasting lesson to humanity. That in other words, humanity wanted their independence, and this is where that led. And so in other words, it's an experience that we have that is also a spiritual experience, and that is supposed to lead us to certain things. And so not everything has to be made easy for us because we're believers. And I've said, God promised us heaven, not a rose garden. So, and we learn about our role in sin, ours in both humanities and ours from a personal perspective as we go through this progressive transformation. So we have a relationship with it as much as we have with any other aspect of our spiritual lives. But it's uncomfortable, and so we don't like to talk about that. So what's the point of spiritual warfare? So why does Satan care that we want to serve God? Nobody's forcing him to do it, so why does he care about us? Once again, I think that that's a pretty fair question. What's it to him? And I think it's funny, when we're talking about spiritual warfare, a lot of times when we deal with people, the question becomes, what is it to you if I want to do something? Why is it bothering you? So when we hear about Christian history, there's also the idea of the perseverance of the saints. Now, I'm not using it in exactly the same context as Calvin did, but it's the concept that the church exists from age to age, despite the fact that Christians experience everything frustration and difficulty to outright persecution. That's kind of a very broad, simple version of Calvin's teaching on it. But the goal of spiritual warfare isn't, as many believers think, a desire to kill everybody on the planet. That's what, if you listen to the wrong teaching on it, Satan's trying to take you out, Satan's trying to take you out, Satan's trying to kill everybody off. Okay, it's actually not that. It's more to be annoying.
So petty.
It's very petty. That's actually a great word. Satan is very petty.
So we've basically really made the idea of warfare our version of war, like the version of modern warfare that we know it today, where it's the goal is to just
annihilate. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's to counter the work of God in the world, and it's to manipulate the believer into walking away from God of their own free will. And this is what I'm going to say from what I've seen, and you talk about petty, it's crafty. I know ministers that were great at what they did. They were great preachers. They were very, very anointed. They were good at what they did. They were good with people, and they're not in ministry now. They're sitting on Facebook complaining about people. And what I'm using that as an example for is that they're not dead, but they're not on task, and they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And some of them, I'm going to say, they're probably never going to wind up back there again. So in this particular kind of context, they walked away from it of their own free will, or what they believe was their own free will. They're not seeing how they're being manipulated through their emotions, through their feelings. And there's something I once said, sometimes Satan just gives us enough of what we think we want to get us entirely away from where we need to be. And these are those instances. And that maybe it didn't work out the way that they wanted, or maybe it wasn't the way that they wanted it to be, and then all of a sudden they're not doing it anymore. Now, there's a lot of ways that this happens in life in a lot of different contexts. And so once again, there is not just one model, but it's making me think about it in terms of the manipulation, that they really believe that where they're at is okay, because they don't feel like doing it anymore. They don't feel like dealing with anybody anymore. They got tired of it. And I'm not going to lie, I don't blame a lot of them. I really don't. I've had enough things over the years where I think about it sometimes too, and I'm going to be really, really honest in saying that. But there's a difference between having a bad day and saying you have a bad ministry, or saying that this is all irrelevant, or saying that you don't reach anybody. Things are different. Things have changed. It's not all warfare. Some of it's just the way that things are right now. But when people start willingly laying stuff down like that, and they just say whatever, they're not dead, they're just kind of out of it. And that's an example of the way that this sometimes works. So to quote the favorite song of mine from my favorite musical, the opposite of war isn't peace, it's creation. And he says that in La Vie Boheme, And I thought about that in terms of spiritual warfare because we often go on the presence that the opposite of being at war is being at peace. But war is destructive, or war is a destructive power that ruins. And so the opposite of that is to create. So let's think about that in a spiritual language. We have the new birth. We have a new creation. The Bible talks about God creating a new heavens and a new earth. There is the constant concept of life being new creation. And so in spiritual warfare, the goal is basically to tear down, or is to destroy. That's the ultimate ending of it. So Satan comes against the believer to stop the work of life, of creating new spiritual work, a new spiritual life, the continuing work of spiritual creation in this world. And the small one that Chuck just went out by, Satan sucks. So pretty much that's Satan is trying to suck the life out of things.
Yep.
So that's how that all kind of connects. Wait a minute. It also means that spiritual warfare is cyclical. Another one of those things that I'm fully waiting for Nick to make a very bad face about, and there it is, that it's not something that's once and done. We don't ever have this final victory this side of heaven or this side of Jesus coming back, which is what people think. That's why they're obnoxious. They think they're going to be as loud as they can and as crazy as they can, and that they're going to win the battle and it's going to be all over and they're going to have the victory over Satan, and it kind of doesn't work like that.
I mean, war doesn't work like that either.
True. No, it doesn't.
You just hold grudges for a few generations, and then when those grudges get...
They come back.
Yeah.
That's actually very true. I didn't think about that.
World War I contributed directly to World War II.
Right. And then after World War II, also contributed to Korea. And in an indirect way contributed to Vietnam, because you have all these different powers and things taking over. And so I see, like in this, and you just pointed out, the opposite of war isn't peace, it's creation. So what do people do after war? They recreate. They try to rebuild their cities. They try to rebuild their lives until the next thing comes along and tears it down. So
it's very Ecclesiastes.
it's extraordinary Ecclesiastes. So
It's like nega prophetic in that sense.
yeah, it's like a negation.
Yeah.
So, discerning spiritual warfare. So this is kind of where this gets interesting. So it's not the easiest things to do. There are often multiple possibilities when something happens, and we should never immediately assume that it's that cause without some sort of discernment. So we should be smart. In other words, if you're not sure, let's rule out other things. If there's a health option, or maybe there's a mental health option, those are things we can explore. It really is okay. So the more we experience spiritual warfare and learn to recognize it, we're better equipped to see it for what it is. And I will also say that sometimes things run parallel. So it might be a physical problem that also has some sort of a spiritual thing behind it. Or it might be, something that plays on people's mental health because they're not taking care of themselves. I mean, there are different ways that things can kind of overlap.
Both and.
It's both and,
Not
exactly.
either or.
It's not either or. So as the old church mothers used to say, everything ain't the devil.
Yeah.
That took you back, didn't it?
Yeah.
And they would have the white outfit on and the big white hat and the handkerchief, and they put their hand on their hip with it. Everything ain't the devil, and they would just stand there like that and say that.
And those
So,
heels.
in the heels, yes, in the kitten heels,
Yep.
not the real high ones. Those, meant you were the pastor's daughter, but the little ones. The ones that meant no man was ever going to be good enough for them. So, an example of this, everything ain't the devil, and this is why this is kind of important. I've told this story before. I knew a woman once who was really, really into all this spiritual warfare stuff, to the point where, quite frankly, she was totally obnoxious. And she was annoying, and I did not like talking to her because it was always, her narration was the whole world was after her, everybody was after her, the dog was after her, and the cat didn't like her, and her neighbors were looking at her sideways, and, that whole thing. So she had a son, and her son was like, 6 or 7, and he, I think, was autistic, and he fell down in the bathtub. And she immediately felt that someone was working witchcraft against her. And she started screaming, and somebody's doing this, and I gotta go pray over my kid. And she's just losing her mind. I didn't know how to break it to her. Nobody cared about her.
She wasn't that important. She wasn't that interesting. You know, like I said, that center of the universe, that, what do you say, main character syndrome? You know, like that she was just the middle of everything and everybody was just trying to come having her name in her mouth. And, you know, people do that on social media. It's like, ain't nobody know who you are. Ain't nobody care. You know, everybody get a grip.
You're not that interesting. You're not that relevant.
You're not that relevant. It's like, get a grip. I mean, but, you know, she was one of those, everything was the devil. Well, everything ain't the devil. And self-care and self-discipline issues are also things we need to entertain that we'll talk about in a little bit. We don't often have the right understanding of stuff, and I think that that can also contribute to things. It's also possible to make more out of a situation than might be present. If things are sometimes obvious, they are what they are, and I believe that our first course should always be what's obvious. So, if something is obvious, let's assume that that's the case, unless there is something to bespeak the opposite. And maybe we just didn't do the right thing sometimes. And we're dealing with consequences. And, you know, sometimes also life just happens. It rains on the just and the unjust alike, and stuff happens, and we don't like that. But, you know, I'll give an example of, you know, how do we know when it is. So there was an example where we were getting ready for Friendsgiving, and you didn't sleep that night, and you had been up all night, and you had not had that in a while. And then I felt kind of off for 2 days before, and even part of that day, and I didn't really understand why. And I suddenly started questioning all sorts of things I had never questioned previously. And I actually wanted to go start a fight with somebody that I had no reason to go start a fight with. I mean, and I thought about it. I got myself real worked up to go have that fight. I didn't want to have that fight. But Satan wanted to impede what we did that was the most successful and the biggest event we've had in 2 years. And so now there's a cause. And if it was nothing else, it was just going to be annoying enough so that we didn't wind up enjoying the day. Now, fortunately, we did. And so there was an example. We didn't need to go spit and scream and, you know, shout and run in circles and throw up. And I don't know what it was with everybody throwing up. Bark. I was in a church once where the woman actually put the anointing oil down somebody's throat. And I went, well, that's why she threw up. Can you imagine that? I can't imagine that. So it was disgusting.
But oils are not supposed to anyway.
Well, was it? It was Harris Teeter brand olive oil. It wasn't even the extra virgin. So anyway, but I still wouldn't just drink that. Okay. So to make things more confusing, so as if we haven't made this confusing enough, spiritual warfare can menace through the issues that we have as people. So, example, if I'm tired and I'm not resting like I should because I'm overworked or I'm under a lot of stress, I might start thinking things or picking on stuff that I might not ordinarily care about. So I might, you know, kind of like we were talking about, get agitated. If someone already tends to slack off or has issues with commitment, they might experience that as even more of an issue or even more of a challenge. And that would be what they battle with. In the case of something like anxiety, it can make it worse. So like you might be even more anxious, or you might even kind of be more agitated. Spiritual warfare also can be confusing, and I would say that that's part of its purpose, because if we perceive it through our physical bodies, our senses, our perceptions, and our thoughts, we might not recognize it for what it is initially. So there's a lot of things to think about there. So how do we tell when it's spiritual warfare? Good question. I think it's a great question. Okay? Asking all these good questions today. So communicate. Okay? Stuff we often don't want to do, especially when we don't feel good. We often think that it's just us. Yes, Nick, would you like to say something?
No, just remembering having that issue that we had a couple years ago where I thought it was just me, and then I talked to you, and it was like, no, it's me too, and then we brought this one, and it's like,
right.
oh, no, it's me too.
And it was like, and I thought it was just me for a long time, so yeah. Often other people will be having their own version of warfare at the same time, especially if you're working on something as a group. So like as a church, or like Friendsgiving, or something of that nature. Sometimes God reveals to us that we are in spiritual warfare, and sometimes gives the answer, sometimes doesn't. through a word, a dream, a prayer, insight, or something else. And conversations can reveal warfare. They can kind of bring it to the head. All right, the next part I'm going to say is the suddenliness of it. So it's a sudden onset of trouble or loss or trial or emotions or thoughts or physical ailments or borderline events or something of that nature. Now, a lot of people also don't talk about, and I don't have this because I thought about it later, so I added it in the notes, in the importance of personality shifts. Now, most of the time when you read this stuff online, they say it's an onslaught of negative or dark emotions. So how would you tell with me? I'm using that as an example. I'm already dark and negative.
You're
so
like, I'm at 95. This is.
So
Can't go much
I
further.
guess maybe if I'm in a good mood, that means I'm in warfare. I don't know. But as a rule, some of us are just dark, and we are just kind of negative, and so that's just kind of. Okay, some of us are just dark in our personalities. Some of us are just kind of pessimistic, negative people. And so to say that you're dark and negative, that ain't a hint. But I would say that it's a shift. That it would be kind of a personality shift to maybe an obsession with something specific or feeling something specific in that vein. And I'm also going to say sudden impulsiveness. And the impulsiveness just might be me. But, especially if you really aren't given to such and, it takes you a really long time to make decisions and you have to think about something and all of a sudden you just want to jump on everything. And you just want to do stuff and you don't even care about it. That's not a really good idea. So, sudden shift in personality, overwhelming emotions when otherwise you were normal. There tends to be confusion. Repeated signs, so might come to recognize symptoms after this happens every so often. You might kind of recognize what it is better. A desire to isolate or overwhelmed with old wounds, past hurts, or suddenly flooded with a lot of very complicated memories. Okay, where people go wrong in spiritual warfare.
Surprised the slide isn't longer.
Oh, well, audience have to condense it. Okay, so there are levels of understanding with spiritual warfare, and too many try to teach very advanced concepts when they don't understand them themselves, or better yet, their audience doesn't understand them, or both. So I think that spiritual warfare is often among a lot of people considered a very advanced teaching, which is dumb because I think it should be part of new believers class, but that's just me. Actually, it is a part of our new members class. So, most people think they're going to be deep and spiritual and what?
And wide.
Deep and wide, yes. That's about as intelligent as a lot of it gets because it sounds super spiritual and
Ignore us.
I'm going to. And so as a result, they don't make it sound practical. They make it sound like it should dominate your existence. And they don't make things general or teach it in a general sense. Now, most of what they do is they teach something so specific to their own experience and perceptions of that experience without considering it may not be universal. So I saw a book written by a guy in Africa on Amazon a couple days ago when I was looking for information on the topic. And he teaches that the key to spiritual warfare is doing things according to his specific understanding of 3 levels of warfare. And so he taught that there were 3 different levels. One was prince, one was king. There were a couple of them. I don't really remember what they all were. And
So you level up.
yeah,
You get enough
basically that you were
experience.
leveling up. And so what the average person is going to do is they're going to read that and, let's talk about mentality here. Nobody wants to think that they're at the bottom. Okay, and we deal with that a lot in Christianity. Nobody wants to be the beginner and accept and admit, hey, maybe I don't know enough about this to really go here. So everybody's going to be on the 3rd level. And they're not considering that there are different spirits and regions. Or that, the spirituality of Africa, even in Christianity, often has a very different outlook than, say, Latin America or North America. And we talked about that in class this week, that, they have their own superstitions and spiritualities, and it's different. It's not the same. So, also, there are a lot of concepts, so like we talk about some of this advanced stuff, and I'm doing this. So one of the biggest ideas that they taught back in the day was that we had gates all over our bodies. So like, for example, you had an ear gate or an eye gate. I just pointed to my eyes when I said ear. So you had an ear gate or an eye gate or a mouth gate. And that basically we had to be overly cautious about everything that we took in. So I'm going to give this as an example. Nick likes Criminal Minds, okay?
Ooh.
You and I don't like Criminal Minds, and Mom and I don't like Criminal Minds because I say I don't want to be in the mind of a serial killer. But you like it. But they would tell you that you shouldn't watch it because you're going to watch that and that's going to affect your ear gate and your eye gate and you're going to become a serial killer. Or it's going to somehow infuse your life in a way that's going to hurt you spiritually. And so you had to watch your gates. That was a really, really, really big thing at the time. Now, it's not going on the premise this interests you so you can handle it. Okay? So you're not doing anything wrong. But a lot of the gate thing revolved around entertainment. So like, for example, not listening to secular music or
Playing violent video games.
Video games, that was one. The video games was one. I'm trying to think of movies.
I didn't watch any movie with cursing in it. No.
Right, with nothing in it. There was at one time something that was a video service. I don't know if it still
Is it
exists. now.
Godflix?
I know, this is before that.
Pureflix?
It was probably a
GodTube.
predecessor
Yeah.
where they would take all the movies that were out and they
They
would...
like censor them, right?
Yeah, they would cut out all the dirty parts and all the bad language. You know,
Yeah.
I guess what about the person who had to edit it? But that's a whole other thing. And that they basically kind of did that. And I remember it's somebody who's very famous, so we're not going to mention any names, but was talking about how, y'all can figure it out, it was a woman and there really aren't that many of them, and was talking about how they thought that the video was okay and they were there with another couple and they put the video on to watch and the first scene was a woman who was topless on a horse. And they went, oh my God, and turned it off and I'm so sorry, da da da, and how then later in the week that image was still burned in their mind. So that's the kind of attitude that people have about this. Like, instead of it just being, okay, maybe you saw a movie that wasn't your speed, you turned it off, let it go. They turn that into a spiritual battle or like a spiritual warfare thing.
And that's why you can't forget about it because you made an obsession out of it.
Right, exactly, but nobody ever talks about that. So I'm also going to say that people aren't versed in spirits enough to teach spiritual warfare. So like, I'm going to give an example once again. We once had somebody who had somebody come to her church. She used to be part of our ministry, and she sent me the binder of the spiritual warfare class that they taught, and how everybody just started casting out demons out of everybody else. It like just turned into this whole mess. And that if you look at the binder, they say that they experienced different demons, and they have a list of them, and they named them. And how one of them was Charlotte, and one of them was Fred. And you know, that's...
Is there like a Becky?
Yes. So, when such is so far removed from the construct and concepts of spirits having names, especially in a biblical context, I mean, y'all are laughing at this. I mean, it was ridiculous. So, yes, Nick.
I was just thinking Becky with the demonic hair instead of Becky with the good hair.
Becky with the demonic hair. That was good. Okay.
Thank you.
Becky
Becky with the horns.
Becky with the horns, yeah. So, good strategy for battle. So, whose is the battle? Now, I'm not going to read all these passages out loud. Basically, whose is the battle? What does everyone say? The battle, it belongs to the Lord. The battle is God's. God will fight my battles. Well, is that biblical? Well, I will put this in the Discord. There's a whole bunch of verses there. There are actually more in my demonology book on it. The bottom line is that the battle is both God's and ours, because ultimately the fight goes to us. It's God's battle, maybe in the spiritual realm, but we fight on God's side. So it's both of ours. It's kind of like the concept that any soldier who's been in a battle says at a certain point the battle's personal. So the battle was theirs because it's personal to them. Everybody making too much out of everything. Okay, so good strategy. The Bible calls us to moderation in all things. We don't like that topic very much, do we?
It's not flashy.
It's not fun and flashy, but if you study the Apostle Paul's spiritual armor in Ephesians 6, most of the suggestions are rather practical. They're not, spitting, sweating, screaming, barking, running around, casting the demon out of the light bill you didn't pay. I mean, there's nothing fancy about it. It's using an illustration that they had in that day, which was the armor that the Roman army used. It's very, very classic. They had the helmet, and I actually have a statue. I should have brought it downstairs. I have two. I've got one that's a higher soldier and one that's a lower soldier. They have a helmet and they have the shield, and the shield is round. Anybody who's seen the 300, you can have an idea of the armor. They had the chest plate, they had the belt that went around their waist that held everything up. I mean, they were very, very practical illustrations. It wasn't deep and spiritual and weird and creepy, like we make this out. And as much as I get that we're bored with our faith sometimes, I mean, I'm sorry that, the Bible doesn't spit out fireworks when we open it up. Spicing it up by creating new problems or not addressing the ones that we have is not going to help us out. It's not going to make it better that the answer's moderation and somehow that translates to, okay, let's be as obnoxious as possible. I mean, it doesn't help us out. So we're going to do our best to maintain moderation. Obviously, we're all works in progress. This is not to be condemning to anybody or make anybody feel like they're doing the wrong thing. It's easier to recognize an attack from another type of problem if we're doing our best to take care of ourselves. So it's like I've said about the Desert Fathers. They invited the demons. They didn't eat. Some of them fasted permanently, and they slept on concrete, and they lashed themselves. It was like
desert.
They lived in the desert. It was like what?
That this one wanted to go to.
That's neither here nor there. They wanted to live in the desert.
It was like screaming, "Come on, let's have a demon party. Come on and infest me. Torment me. And it's like I've said, I mean, don't get me wrong, I really do respect their spirituality, but their methods were not healthy, and I do not endorse that. So, the spiritual armor. So, the Bible tells us to be strong. In the Lord and in His mighty power, let your strength come from God. So, that's ultimately what we recognize therein. And we put on the full armor of God to be fully equipped from spiritual perspective from any attack. Now, we put it on. It doesn't just jump on us. Okay, just like God gave the manna to the Israelites, but the Israelites had to go get it. It didn't just fly on their plates.
Process.
Right. We have to make the effort to put it on. So if we don't want to put it on, God's not going to make us put it on. It's not going to just fly on us. I mean, there was this time, I was in 8th grade, and this kid had on this horrible shirt and a tie that was equally loud that did not match. And I asked him if he got dressed in the dark or his clothes attacked him. That's not how that works with the spiritual warfare, okay? Don't work like that. All right, so our struggle is not with flesh and blood, but powers, principalities, and authorities in the demonic. So we recognize the enemy that we have. People work as those agents, but sometimes spending so much time on the people end of it is a waste of time. So the belt of truth went around the waist, and it basically girded, it held you up, and it also held up what you had on. That truth holds you upright. And I mean, this I always say, we could do the whole armor of God as like a 6 or 7 part series. And when you talk about one part of it, so we're kind of going through it quickly. The breastplate of righteousness, let righteousness guard your heart. And so it kind of went over, and it was here. And so it kind of protected from there so that you didn't get hit all the time. Oh, here we have another one of these. Okay, so shoes of peace. I always like the shoes of peace, so I would like shoes. So be guided and moved in wholeness, not in peacekeeping, but peacemaking. So an awful lot of us focus on keeping peace. We don't want anybody to be upset, and we don't want to disturb anything, and we don't really want to confront or deal with issues versus actually making peace. What do they say? Civis pacem para bellum. If you want peace, you have to prepare for war. So, okay. Shield of faith, so that it's a big round shield that they would hold out from the body and that they would use to extinguish arrows that they would literally set on fire and throw. Doesn't that sound lovely? The things people think to do, okay? So the things thrown at us that we aren't prepared to handle, that, kind of come from that angle. the helmet of salvation, know and be assured of the promise of salvation, even if you don't understand everything about it. And they would like put a thing, it must have been heavy. I wonder how much all this stuff weighed. So the sword of the Spirit is the word, and that word is logos. So it is revelation, the revelation of God that comes through the word of wisdom and the word of knowledge. It is actually not the Bible. Fascinating, isn't it, when we actually learn context? Praying in the Spirit, pray is guided by the Spirit, whether in tongues or in English, bring everything to God. So assets for spiritual warfare. Prayer. So everyone who encountered spiritual warfare prayed often and often very hard. Job was always praying. Job just had this big, huge, long conversation. And it's not time to abandon a prayer life when we're going through spiritual difficulties, which is what often a lot of people want to do. And as a side note, group prayer and communication can be very, very essential once again. So don't isolate yourself. And then we have our favorite topic, self-care. So it's not the time to go on a year-long fast or make a bunch of life-changing decisions or decide to uproot yourself and stop talking to all your spiritual friends. It's not the right time to do that. Finding good physical and mental health balances and enhances one's victory in spiritual warfare. So take care of your issues. Take care of the stuff that you need to take care of, because that will make it better to identify, and it will also make the process better. Our summary is spiritual warfare has many facets and can feel complicated, but it comes down to the basics of developing a strong spiritual life that can withstand difficult times. So, and then we say, thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on Kingdom Now. I pray it proves to be a blessing in your life. To learn more about this work, ask a question, submit feedback or a topic suggestion, advertise on air, or donate to this work, visit my website, which contains essential information and links for other points of contact around the web at kingdompowernow.org. Also, if you are in our area and would like to visit Sanctuary International Fellowship Tabernacle SIFT, visit welcomethisplace.org. Until next time, this is Apostle Dr. Leanne Marino reminding you that the kingdom of God is within you, and that means the kingdom is now.